Music thundered through the estate's courtyard, brass and drums colliding in celebration. Lanterns swayed overhead, throwing gold light across a sea of families gathered for the child's dedication. 100 of the most dangerous men in the hemisphere, all pretending, for one night, to be ordinary fathers and uncles and friends. Somewhere near the fountain, an old man wept openly at the sight of the infant being blessed, overcome by a sentimentality none of his enemies would have believed him capable of. For one evening, the entire architecture of fear that governed these families quietly agreed to rest. And standing beside her father, in a room built entirely around his power, was Elena. Everyone in that room understood the unspoken law. You could look at her. You were forbidden to approach her. Men twice her father's size had learned that lesson the hard way, and none of them were foolish enough to test it twice. She had grown used to existing at the center of every gathering while remaining completely untouched by it, a fixture admired from a careful distance. Like a painting nobody was permitted to stand too close to. Then the music seemed to falter. A man near the far wall rose from his seat, and the entire room noticed him do it. Conversations dimmed mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Bodyguards straightened without being told to. Carnell was walking toward Elena. Her stomach dropped. She had heard the name whispered in rooms like this one, always with a strange mixture of respect and dread. She looked away instinctively, already certain of what was coming. A warning. A dismissal, perhaps worse. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her. He complimented her with a kind of restraint that unsettled her more than flattery would have. He gave his family name plainly, like a man laying a card on the table and daring anyone to call it. Then he turned to face her father directly, and the room seemed to hold its breath as one. He spoke to him in Spanish. Her father answered him, calmly, fluently, as though this were the most natural exchange in the world. Nobody in that room had ever heard him speak that gently to anyone. Then Carnell asked the question that no man in the history of that family had ever dared to ask out loud. "Sir, I would like your permission to take your daughter on a date." The silence that followed had weight. Men who carried weapons under their jackets found themselves holding still, waiting for the room to explode. Instead, her father looked at him for a long moment and said only, "Bring her home safely." The room did not move for several seconds. Nobody understood what they had just witnessed. To understand why 4 simple words shattered every rule in that house, you have to go back. Long before the party. Long before Carnell. Back to the truth about who Elena's father really was, and the secret he had been burying for over 20 years. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because trust me, you do not want to miss what happens in this story. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's get into it. 3 years earlier, in a border town nobody bothered naming on official maps, people spoke of Elena's father only in fragments, a tilt of the head, a lowered voice, a quick change of subject whenever a stranger asked too many questions. Nobody could say exactly what he had done to earn that fear. They only knew, with total certainty, that they should never test it. Elena had grown up inside that silence like a plant grown inside a locked room, reaching toward light that never quite reached her. She attended the same school as everyone else, sat in the same classrooms, memorized the same equations, but she existed behind glass. Boys who might have approached her simply didn't. Girls who might have befriended her kept a careful, polite distance, the kind reserved for something beautiful and dangerous, like standing near a cliff edge. She remembered, with a clarity that still stung, the year a boy named Hakun had worked up the courage to walk her home after class. He carried her books without being asked. He made her laugh twice, which at the time felt like an accomplishment worth remembering. He never came near her again after that single afternoon. She later learned, through a cousin who overheard it secondhand, that her father's men had simply appeared at the boy's house that same evening, said nothing threatening at all, and left. That was enough. It was always enough. Nobody ever needed to raise a voice or a hand. The mere presence of her father's name did the threatening on its own. She used to watch her classmates from across the courtyard, laughing, exchanging notes, planning weekends that never included her. She used to wonder what it might feel like to be ordinary, to be asked to a movie, to be teased by a boy who had no idea what her last name could summon into a room. She kept a small, private list in her mind of things she imagined an ordinary life might contain: holding hands in a crowded hallway, a boy nervous enough to fumble his own words, a Saturday spent doing absolutely nothing that mattered to anyone but her. She never told anyone about that list, Some things felt too fragile to say out loud, as though speaking them would only confirm how far out of reach they actually were. There was a particular birthday, her 17th, that she still thought about more often than she wanted to admit. Her mother had quietly arranged a small gathering, nothing extravagant, just a handful of girls from school who had agreed to attend more out of curiosity than friendship. Elena remembered standing in the doorway of her own party, watching those girls whisper among themselves near the cake, watching them glance nervously toward the hallway every time a guard's footsteps echoed past. Nobody stayed past 9. Nobody ever did. She blew out the candles alone in the kitchen an hour later, her mother pretending not to notice her, wipe her eyes before rejoining the room. And she promised herself, quietly, that she would stop expecting anything different from birthdays after that. It wasn't cruelty that isolated her, it was gravity. People orbited her family out of necessity or fear, never out of genuine desire, and she had long since stopped being able to tell the difference between someone who liked her and someone who was simply too afraid to leave. Her father wasn't cruel. That was the strange, aching contradiction she carried. He was quiet, almost gentle in the confined spaces of their home. The version of him nobody outside ever witnessed. He remembered how she took her coffee. He noticed when she'd had a difficult day before she said a single word about it. He kept, tucked into the drawer of his desk, every report card she had ever brought home, going back to her earliest years of school, though he had never once mentioned keeping them. She found them by accident when she was 16, searching for a pen, and she sat on the floor of his office for nearly an hour afterward, unsure what to do with the tenderness hiding underneath a man the entire border town feared. But there remained a wall behind his eyes, a locked door she had knocked on 1,000 times throughout her childhood and never once been allowed through. She used to ask him, quietly, why people feared him. He would change the subject with practiced ease, redirecting her toward homework, toward dinner, toward anything except the truth. Eventually she stopped asking. Some questions, she learned, were simply not meant to be answered. But here's where it gets complicated. Because while Elena believed her isolation was simply the unfortunate cost of her father's reputation, the truth ran considerably deeper than that. Buried under 2 decades of silence so carefully constructed that even her mother rarely spoke of it. 22 years earlier, in that same border town, 2 young men had been inseparable, closer than brothers, the kind of friendship built in childhood and hardened by loyalty through their 20s. One of them was Elena's father. The other was a man whose name would one day belong to Carnell. They had built everything together in those early years: trust, territory, a partnership that outsiders assumed was unbreakable. And at the center of that friendship stood a woman neither of them ever spoke about afterward, a woman whose name had been erased so completely from family conversation that Carnell himself had grown up never once hearing it. Something happened between them, something that ended a friendship so completely that within a single year, one man vanished from the border town entirely, taking his infant son with him, rebuilding an empire an ocean away in soul, while the other stayed behind and built his own quiet kingdom out of guilt he never spoke aloud. Carnell had grown up believing his father simply chose to leave. He never knew there had been a betrayal. He never knew the reason his father rarely smiled, rarely trusted, rarely let anyone close enough to matter. He only knew a version of the story stripped of its most devastating details. Which meant, on the night of that dedication, when Carnell crossed the courtyard toward a girl he had never met, he had absolutely no idea he was walking directly into the wreckage his own father had left behind 2 decades earlier. And Elena's father knew it. Every single second of that walk, he knew exactly who was approaching his daughter, and exactly whose blood ran through the young man's veins. That's the part nobody in that courtyard understood. That's the part that made "bring her home safely" the most complicated sentence that man had ever spoken in his life. Now hold on to that, because it matters more than you think. Let's rewind further, back to Elena herself, 3 months before that dedication, living a life that felt, to her, like watching the world through a window she wasn't permitted to open. She spent most evenings on the balcony of her family's house, overlooking a street she wasn't allowed to walk alone. Guards rotated at the gate below. Polite, professional, permanently present. She had grown used to their shapes the way other people grow used to furniture. She rarely acknowledged them anymore. They rarely acknowledged her, beyond a respectful nod whenever she passed. She had one friend, technically, a girl named Ye Jun from a neighboring family with its own complicated history, someone permitted into Elena's orbit because their fathers maintained a fragile business arrangement, Ye-jun visited occasionally, always trailed by her own security, and the two of them would sit for hours discussing nothing in particular, simply grateful for the presence of another girl their age who understood, at least partially, what it meant to live behind glass. It was Ye-jun who first mentioned Carnell's name to her, weeks before the dedication. In the careless way teenagers mention names that mean nothing to them yet. She'd heard her own father discussing a man from Seoul, someone whose organization had grown large enough to draw attention even in circles as insulated as theirs. She repeated the name the way she might repeat gossip about a celebrity, with no understanding of what that name would eventually mean to her friend. Elena remembered nodding politely, filing the name away without any particular feeling attached to it, having absolutely no reason to believe it would ever matter to her personally. But somewhere in Seoul, that same week, Carnell's father had received an invitation to a child's dedication, extended through an intermediary, phrased with careful, deliberate neutrality. An invitation that, on its surface, looked like nothing more than the routine diplomacy of powerful men maintaining fragile peace. Carnell's father stared at that invitation for a long time before responding. He recognized the family name instantly. He had spent 22 years trying not to think about it. And here's the twist that should make you sit up straight, because this is where everything starts unraveling. He didn't decline the invitation. He accepted it, deliberately, and he brought his son. That decision, quiet, calculated, made alone in an office late at night, set into motion everything that would happen at that dedication. Because Carnell's father hadn't simply chosen to reconnect. He had chosen, after 22 years of silence, to finally walk back into the life of the man who destroyed his family. And he brought the one person capable of reopening every wound both men had spent 2 decades trying to bury. If you're catching what I'm laying down right now, drop a comment below, because it only gets more intense from here. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people. Let's continue. The morning of the dedication, Elena stood in front of her mirror longer than usual, though she couldn't explain why. She told herself it was simply a formal event, another gathering where she would stand quietly beside her father, smile when required, and disappear the moment it was socially acceptable to do so. She had no idea that within a few hours, a man she had never met would walk directly toward her in front of 100 witnesses and ask her father a question no one in that world had ever dared ask aloud. She had no idea her father already knew his answer before Carnell finished the sentence. And she certainly had no idea that the man approaching her carried, without realizing it, the exact bloodline her father had spent 22 years trying to forget. Their first date began, of all places, at a small cafe Elena had walked past 100 times but never once entered, tucked into a quiet corner where the noise of the city softened into something almost peaceful. Carnell had chosen it deliberately. No cameras, no associates, no audience to perform for, just 2 people and 2 cups of coffee. Neither of them ended up finishing. He arrived first. Elena noticed that immediately. The way he stood when she walked in, the way he pulled out her chair without making a production of it. She had expected arrogance. She had expected the kind of confidence that fills a room and demands attention. Instead, she found someone strangely careful with his words, almost cautious, as though he understood exactly how fragile this moment was, and refused to be the one who broke it. Conversation started clumsily. He asked about her studies. She asked about Seoul, a city she had only ever seen in photographs. He described it in fragments, the neon reflected on wet pavement after rain, the sound of the subway at midnight, the strange comfort of a city that never fully slept. She listened the way someone listens when they've been starved of ordinary conversation for years. At one point she asked him, half joking, whether a man in his position ever got to simply sit somewhere without calculating every exit in the room. He laughed, genuinely, the first unguarded sound she had heard from him all evening, and admitted that he had chosen this particular cafe specifically because it only had one door, which made it easier to relax rather than harder. It was such an honest, unexpectedly ordinary answer that she found herself laughing too, and for a moment neither of them felt like the people their families had made them. Neither of them mentioned their fathers. Neither of them mentioned the courtyard, or the silence that followed his question, or the security detail waiting outside at a respectful distance, pretending not to watch. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena simply existed as a girl on a date, not as the daughter of a man everyone feared. Somewhere near the end of that first meeting, she asked him plainly why he had crossed that courtyard at all, knowing exactly what it could have cost him. He considered the question for a long moment before answering that he had spent years watching men in his position accumulate everything except a single moment that felt genuinely his own, and that something about the way she looked away from him, rather than toward him, had convinced him she might be the only person in that entire courtyard who wasn't performing for anyone. He said it without embellishment, the way a man states something he has already turned over privately many times before ever speaking it aloud. She didn't have a response ready for that. She simply looked at him for a while, recalibrating everything she had assumed about who he might be, and allowed herself, cautiously, to consider that perhaps this version of her life wasn't a mistake waiting to be corrected. They talked for 3 hours. It felt, to her, like 20 minutes. Over the following weeks, the dates continued, always quiet, always careful, always shielded from anyone who might carry word back to either family faster than either of them wanted. Long drives along the coastline, where Elena rolled down the window and let the wind pull her hair loose, laughing at something Carnell said that wasn't even particularly funny, laughing simply because she could. Slow walks through nearly empty parks at hours when nobody else was around to notice them together. One evening, he took her to a small night market on the edge of the city, somewhere he swore none of his associates would recognize him, and they ate street food standing shoulder to shoulder at a plastic table, and she remembered thinking, with a kind of disbelief that almost embarrassed her, that this was the happiest she had felt in years, standing in an alley eating noodles from a paper container. Another night, caught in a sudden downpour with no umbrella between them, they ducked beneath the awning of a closed bookstore and stood there for nearly 40 minutes waiting out the rain, talking about nothing important, her shoulder pressed lightly against his arm, neither of them in any particular hurry for the rain to stop. She would remember that awning long after she stopped remembering most of the details from that period, the specific, useless kind of memory that only forms around moments that actually mattered. She learned that he preferred silence over small talk, that he listened more than he spoke, that beneath the reputation attached to his name existed someone who noticed small things, the way she stirred her coffee counterclockwise, the way she went quiet whenever her father's name came up in conversation, the way she always ordered the same pastry and never admitted she had a favorite. He never pushed. He simply noticed and waited, and let her fill the silence whenever she was ready to. There was an evening, roughly a month into whatever this had become, when he took her to the top of a parking structure overlooking the harbor, an unglamorous location he swore was the best view in the entire city, better than any restaurant rooftop his money could have bought them. They sat on the hood of his car with takeout containers balanced between them, watching container ships move slowly toward the horizon, and she asked him, half teasing, whether he had brought other women to this exact spot before. He answered honestly, without flinching, that he hadn't, that something about the ordinariness of a parking structure had never seemed worth sharing with anyone until her. She didn't say anything back. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder and let the silence hold the weight of what neither of them was ready to name yet. It was around this same time that she began noticing how differently he treated the people who worked for him, a small detail that told her more about his character than any of his reputation ever had. He remembered the names of drivers most men in his position would never bother learning. He tipped generously and without performance, the kind of habit formed long before anyone was watching to admire it. She found herself building a private case for him in her mind, evidence gathered quietly, proof that the version of him whispered about in fearful rooms was only a fraction of who he actually was. She began to change in ways so gradual she barely noticed them herself. She laughed more easily. She stood a little taller. She started humming under her breath while getting ready in the mornings, something her mother eventually pointed out with a raised eyebrow and a smile she didn't fully explain. The girl who had spent years watching life happen from behind glass finally felt herself stepping through it. But here's where things start shifting, and I need you to remember this moment, because it becomes important very soon. Because while Elena was falling into something she had never been permitted to feel, her father was watching every single development from a careful distance, saying nothing to her directly, but making calls she knew nothing about. He reached out to Carnell privately, twice, in the earliest weeks. Quiet conversations, held far from Elena's knowledge, each one ending the same way. He told him plainly to walk away from his daughter. He offered no explanation beyond the weight of his own authority, the assumption that his word alone would be sufficient. Carnell refused both times, respectfully but firmly, unwilling to explain to a man twice his age why he had no intention of disappearing from a life he had only just begun to matter in. He told him, plainly, that he respected the man's position, but did not answer to him, and that Elena was old enough to decide for herself who deserved a place in her life. Elena's father hadn't expected the refusal. Men rarely refused him twice, let alone with the calm certainty Carnell carried into both conversations. It unsettled him more than open defiance would have, because it told him this wasn't a young man chasing a conquest. This was something closer to conviction, and conviction was far harder to dismantle than infatuation. The third conversation carried a different tone entirely. Less request, more warning. Elena's father made it clear that continued involvement would carry consequences neither of them wanted to discuss openly. He reminded him, in careful, measured language, exactly how far his reach extended, and exactly how little it would cost him to make Carnell's presence in that city considerably more difficult than it currently was. Carnell still didn't understand why. He assumed, reasonably, that this was simply the ordinary paranoia of a powerful man protecting an only daughter. He had no idea he was standing on ground far more complicated than territory or reputation. He didn't back down immediately, but something in him shifted after that third conversation, a caution creeping into decisions that had previously felt effortless. Elena noticed before she understood why. His calls grew shorter. Plans that once felt certain began dissolving into vague rescheduling. A warmth that had once felt so natural between them started cooling, degree by degree, until she found herself staring at her phone at night, rereading old messages, searching for some explanation buried in his words that she had somehow missed. There was one night, near the worst of it, when she finally reached him by phone after nearly a week of silence, and his voice on the other end sounded so distant, so carefully rehearsed, that she almost didn't recognize it as his. She asked him directly whether he still wanted this, whether whatever they had built over the past 2 months was already over. He hesitated long enough that the hesitation itself answered the question before he even attempted to. He told her it was complicated. He told her he needed time. He told her nothing at all that resembled the man who had once laughed at himself on top of a parking structure, unguarded and easy, a version of him she was quickly beginning to fear she had imagined entirely. She hung up that night and sat on the floor of her room for a long time, knees pulled to her chest, replaying every date, every rooftop, every stolen hour, searching for the exact moment she had misread something that clearly hadn't been real to begin with. It never occurred to her that the retreat wasn't coming from him at all, but from a threat leveled against him by the one person she trusted most in the world. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself people simply grow busy, that reputations like his came with demands she couldn't fully understand. But some quiet, aching part of her recognized the pattern immediately, because she had watched this exact kind of retreat happen before, with every single person who had ever gotten close enough to matter, and then vanished the moment her father's name entered the equation. She confronted her mother first, gently, searching for information rather than accusation. Her mother's hesitation told her everything her silence refused to. Her mother busied herself with a task that didn't need doing, straightening papers that were already straight, and told Elena, in a voice that didn't quite hold steady, that some things were better left to her father to explain in his own time. It was the kind of answer that confirmed more than it concealed. Elena noticed something else in that conversation too, something she couldn't quite name at the time but returned to often in the days that followed. Her mother's discomfort hadn't felt like the discomfort of someone protecting her husband's secrets out of loyalty. It had felt personal, almost guilty, the kind of unease that belonged to someone with a stake in the story, rather than someone simply guarding it on another person's behalf. She filed the observation away without understanding it, the way she had filed away Yejun's careless mention of Carnell's name months earlier, with no idea yet how much weight it would eventually carry. It didn't take long after that for the truth to surface. A staff member's careless comment about phone calls made behind closed doors. A conversation overheard through a door left slightly open. Her father's voice lower and harder than she had ever heard it directed at anyone. Pieces assembling themselves into a picture she wished, desperately, she hadn't seen clearly. Her father had been interfering, quietly, deliberately, working behind her back to dismantle the first genuine happiness she had experienced in years. She confronted him directly, something she had rarely done in her entire life. She waited until the household staff had gone for the evening, until it was only the two of them in the study where he kept those old report cards locked away, and she asked him outright whether he had spoken to Carnell. Her voice shook, not from fear, but from an anger that had been building silently for far longer than this single situation deserved. She told him she knew what he had done. She told him, with a rawness that clearly caught him off guard, that this was the first time in her life she had ever felt truly happy, and he had taken it from her without even the decency of an explanation. She reminded him, her voice cracking despite her best effort to keep it level, of every birthday spent without a single friend in attendance, every dance she never went to, every ordinary milestone quietly stolen from her by the shadow of his name, and asked him whether he intended to take this too. Her father stood there for a long moment, something shifting behind eyes that rarely revealed anything at all. He sat down slowly, as though the weight of the conversation had physically settled onto his shoulders, and gestured for her to sit as well. She refused, choosing instead to remain standing, arms folded, waiting. He began to explain, slowly, carefully. He told her there was history between their families, something older and more complicated than she could possibly understand, something that had nothing to do with her personally, and everything to do with mistakes made decades before she was even born. But he stopped short. He gave her enough truth to justify his actions without giving her the truth that actually mattered. He never mentioned the woman. He never mentioned what he had actually done 22 years earlier, or why Carnell's father had spent 2 decades building an empire on the other side of the world rather than remain anywhere near him. Elena left that conversation with more questions than answers, carrying a partial truth that felt, somehow, even heavier than complete ignorance had. She lay awake most of that night, replaying his words, searching for the shape of whatever he had refused to say, certain only that the missing piece was larger than anything he had admitted to. And 3 days later, without any warning at all, Carnell showed up at her gate. Not to end things. To ask her a question that would eventually pull both families back into a room together for the first time in over 20 years. A dinner neither father wanted, and neither father could refuse. If you're already sensing where this is heading, comment part 2 below right now, because trust me, you are going to want to see how this unfolds. Carnell stood at the gate for a long moment before Elena came outside, and when she did, she found him quieter than she had ever seen him, his usual composure replaced by something closer to uncertainty. He hadn't called ahead, which was unlike him, and the guards at the gate had clearly debated whether to let him wait there at all before deciding it wasn't their place to turn him away. He told her he wasn't there to walk away. He told her the distance of the past few weeks hadn't been about losing interest, but about pressure he hadn't known how to navigate. Pressure from a source he still didn't fully understand himself. He admitted, with visible discomfort, that her father had approached him more than once, warning him away without ever explaining why. Elena studied him carefully, weighing whether to share what little truth she had gathered. Eventually she did, telling him what her father had admitted, the vague mention of history between their families, the mistakes he refused to specify. Carnell's expression shifted the moment she said it. Something flickered behind his eyes, a memory stirring that he couldn't quite place. He told her, slowly, that he intended to ask his own father directly. If there was history buried between their families, he deserved to understand it before deciding what came next. That conversation happened the following evening, in his father's office in Seoul, a room Carnell rarely entered without being summoned first. His father sat behind his desk for a long time after Carnell asked the question, silent in a way that told Carnell this silence carried weight rather than confusion. Then, finally, his father began to speak. He told him about the border town, about the man who had once been closer to him than a brother, a partnership built over years of shared risk and mutual loyalty, the kind of bond that felt, at the time, unbreakable. He described their early years together with an unexpected softness, the long nights building something out of nothing, the trust that had once felt as solid as stone beneath both their feet. And then he told him about the woman, Carnell's mother. He explained, with a restraint that barely concealed the old pain underneath it, that his closest friend had betrayed him in the most devastating way possible, pursuing the one relationship that should have remained untouchable between them. He explained that by the time he discovered the truth, the damage had already reshaped everything, a friendship destroyed so completely that within a year he had taken his infant son and left the border town entirely, rebuilding his life and his empire an ocean away in Seoul. He had never told Carnell any of it. He had allowed his son to grow up believing their departure was simply ambition, simply the natural expansion of a growing organization, rather than the aftermath of the deepest betrayal of his life. He described, in a voice grown suddenly quieter, the exact night he discovered the truth, arriving home earlier than expected, finding evidence he spent years afterward wishing he had never uncovered. He described the particular cruelty of losing not one relationship but 2 in a single evening, a wife and a friendship, both severed by the same betrayal, both people he had trusted more than anyone else alive. He told Carnell that he had never remarried, not because opportunity never presented itself, but because some part of him remained convinced that trust, once broken that completely, was not a thing a man was permitted to rebuild twice in one lifetime. Carnell listened without interrupting, understanding for the first time why his father had raised him the way he had, cautious of every alliance, slow to trust even men who had served the family faithfully for years. It wasn't paranoia born from the business. It was grief, worn so long it had calcified into something indistinguishable from personality. Carnell sat in stunned silence, pieces of his own childhood rearranging themselves around this new information. The distance his father had always maintained from other men, the caution that bordered on paranoia, the refusal to ever discuss the early years back home. None of it had ever made sense to him until this exact moment. He thought of every birthday his father had spent alone, despite having every resource in the world to build a new family if he'd wanted one. Every anniversary of nothing that his father quietly observed behind a closed office door. And he finally understood that he hadn't simply been raised by a careful man. He had been raised by a man still actively grieving 22 years later, a loss he had never once allowed himself to name out loud. And then, slowly, a different question began forming in his mind, one that made his stomach tighten before he even said it aloud. If Elena's father was the man who had done this to their family, why had he allowed Carnell to approach her that night at the dedication? Why hadn't he simply refused on the spot, ended it before it began, protected the fragile peace both families had maintained for over 2 decades through careful distance? His father was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said, with something almost like exhaustion in his voice, that he honestly didn't know. But he suspected, if the man he once called a brother still carried even a fraction of the guilt he should carry, that granting permission may have been the closest thing to an apology he was capable of offering after 22 years of silence. Here's the part that should send a chill down your spine, because this changes absolutely everything about that courtyard scene you watched at the very beginning of this story. Elena's father hadn't simply been surprised by Carnell's approach that night. He had recognized him instantly. He had seen, standing in front of him, the son of the man he had wronged decades earlier, and in that single, unbearable moment, he made a choice that had been building inside him for 22 years. He said yes, not because he trusted the situation, not because he believed it was safe, but because some quiet, aching part of him saw an opportunity to repair something he had spent 2 decades believing could never be repaired. He never explained any of this to Elena. He couldn't. Some truths, he had decided long ago, were his alone to carry, regardless of the cost. But now, with both families' secrets pulled halfway into the light, there was no path forward that didn't eventually lead the 2 men back into the same room together. That room ended up being a dinner table. Carnell approached his father cautiously, asking whether Elena might be permitted to join them for a meal, expecting resistance, expecting the same caution his father had shown around this entire situation from the beginning. Instead, his father agreed almost immediately. Then he asked for something Carnell hadn't anticipated at all. He asked that both of Elena's parents be invited as well, a full dinner. Both families, together, for the first time in over 20 years. Carnell hesitated before relaying the invitation, uncertain what his father intended by requesting something so deliberately provocative. But he extended the invitation anyway, and to his genuine surprise, Elena's father accepted without argument. The evening arrived with a strange, deliberate formality. Carnell's father had chosen the venue himself, a private dining room overlooking the harbor, its long table set with more precision than the occasion technically required, as though he needed the ritual of preparation to steady himself for what was coming. Staff moved silently in and out, refilling glasses nobody had finished, adjusting place settings that were already correct. He arrived at the appointed evening dressed formally, composed, betraying nothing of what this dinner truly meant to him. Beside him walked his wife, Elena's mother, elegant and quiet, entirely unaware of the history waiting for her inside that house. The moment she stepped through the door and saw Carnell's father standing across the room, something in her expression flickered, just briefly, before she composed herself into practiced neutrality. She recovered so quickly that even Elena, standing beside her, noticed nothing more than a passing hesitation, easily mistaken for the ordinary nervousness of an unfamiliar room. He recognized her too. Instantly. 22 years hadn't dulled that recognition even slightly. He extended a hand in greeting with practiced ease, and when their fingers touched, briefly, formally, neither of them allowed their expression to betray a single thing. Neither spouse noticed the exchange. Elena's father was focused on his daughter, watching her interact with Carnell with an unreadable expression. Carnell's own attention remained fixed on the tension he could sense but not fully explain. Dinner proceeded with careful, practiced calm, polite conversation, careful compliments about the wine, about the view, about nothing that mattered. At one point, Elena's father raised a glass and offered a toast to renewed friendships. And the phrase landed differently for the two older men at the table than it did for anyone else in the room, each of them absorbing it with a stillness that passed, to the untrained eye, as simple politeness. Every person at that table performing normalcy while an entirely different current moved silently beneath the surface, one that only two people in that room fully understood. At one point, Elena's mother asked Carnell's father, with polite curiosity, how long he had lived in Seoul, and the table went quiet for just a fraction longer than the question warranted before he answered smoothly that it had been over 2 decades now, long enough that the city felt more like home than the place he'd been born. Elena's father took a slow sip of his wine at that exact moment, saying nothing, though his knuckles tightened almost imperceptibly around the stem of the glass. Carnell noticed it, filing it away without understanding its significance yet, another small piece of a puzzle he wouldn't fully assemble until much later that night. Later, as dessert was served, Carnell's father raised his own glass and offered a quiet toast to the two young people at the table, wishing them a happiness neither generation before them had managed to hold on to. The words landed strangely in the room, warm on the surface and unbearably heavy underneath. And only Elena's mother seemed to fully register the second meaning buried inside them, her hand trembling faintly around the stem of her glass, before she composed herself and drank. Elena found herself relaxing as the evening wore on, encouraged by how naturally her father seemed to be engaging with Carnell's, laughing at some remark about business rivals from decades past, refilling his own glass without being prompted. She allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to believe that whatever tension had once existed between the families might genuinely be dissolving over roasted fish and quiet conversation. At one point, between courses, Carnell leaned toward Elena and asked, quietly enough that only she could hear him, whether she trusted him. It was an unusual question for the middle of a formal dinner, and she studied him for a moment before answering that she did, more than she had ever trusted anyone outside her own family. He nodded slowly, as though her answer had settled something he needed settled before the night went any further, and reached briefly for her hand beneath the table before letting it go again. Nobody at that table could have predicted what would happen the moment dinner ended. Because when Carnell's father excused himself to retrieve something from his office, and Elena's mother followed only minutes later under the pretense of finding the restroom, they were about to reopen a door that had remained sealed for 22 years. The office door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Carnell's father stood near the window, a small wrapped box sitting untouched on his desk, the excuse he had used to slip away from the table now completely forgotten. He turned when he heard the door close, and when he saw who had followed him, something in his posture changed, the careful composure of the dinner table dissolving into something far more unguarded. She asked him, quietly, why he had done this. Why extend an invitation after 22 years of silence? Why insist on both families sitting at the same table, knowing exactly what it would stir back to the surface? He didn't answer immediately. He studied her the way a man studies something he convinced himself he no longer wanted, only to discover the wanting had never actually left. He told her, honestly, that he wasn't entirely sure himself, that perhaps some part of him needed to see her again before he could finally let it go, that perhaps another part of him had never wanted to let it go at all. She told him this was reckless, dangerous. That reopening something buried this deep could unravel more than either of them was prepared to survive. He agreed with her, quietly, and then closed the distance between them anyway. Whatever had existed between them decades ago hadn't weakened with time. If anything, 22 years of separation had only pressurized it, and the moment they were alone in that room, everything neither of them had said out loud came rushing back at once. Old familiarity, old longing, a gravity neither of them had ever fully escaped, no matter how far or how long they had run from it. Out on the terrace, away from the dining room and unaware of what was unfolding behind the office door down the hall, Carnell had asked Elena to step outside with him for a moment, claiming he needed air after the wine. She had followed him without suspicion, still glowing from how smoothly the evening had gone, still certain, for the first time in weeks, that the two families might genuinely find their way toward peace. He stood facing the harbor for a long moment before turning to her, and she noticed, too late to prepare herself, that his hands were faintly unsteady, a tremor she had never once seen in him before. He told her that he had spent months trying to find language large enough for what he felt for her, and had failed every single time, because nothing he came up with ever felt equal to the way she had rearranged the architecture of his entire life since the night of that dedication. He told her that whatever history existed between their families, whatever secrets neither of them fully understood yet, he no longer wanted to build his future around avoiding them. He wanted to build it around her. He reached into his jacket and produced a small box, plain, unassuming, nothing like the ostentatious displays she imagined men of his position typically favored. He didn't kneel, he simply opened it and held her gaze, and asked her, in a voice stripped of all its usual composure, whether she would marry him. Elena stood frozen for a moment that felt, to her, considerably longer than it actually was, her mind racing backward through every stolen date, every rooftop conversation, every moment she had quietly wondered whether happiness like this was something she was even allowed to have. Then, before she had fully decided to move, she was already nodding, already reaching for him, the word yes arriving somewhere between a whisper and a sob. Neither of them had any idea, in that suspended, radiant moment on the terrace, that 22 years of buried betrayal was unraveling simultaneously behind a closed office door only a hallway away. Meanwhile, back at the table, Elena's father noticed his wife's absence stretching longer than a bathroom trip should reasonably take. He glanced toward the hallway once, then again, an old instinct stirring somewhere beneath his composed exterior, the kind of instinct that had kept him alive and in power for decades. He excused himself quietly, telling Elena and Carnell he would only be a moment. His footsteps moved down the hallway with deliberate calm, though something in his chest had already begun tightening, some part of him sensing, before he could name it, exactly what he might find. He reached the office door. He paused there, listening, though he told himself he was simply making sure his wife was all right. His hand rose toward the doorknob. Every second stretched unbearably long, the hallway silent except for the faint murmur of conversation, still drifting from the dining room behind him. He turned the knob halfway, ready to push the door open, ready to confront whatever waited on the other side of 22 years of buried history. Then, from behind him, a voice cut through the silence. "Daddy!" He turned instantly, his hand falling away from the door. Elena was running toward him down the hallway, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with tears that had nothing to do with sadness, her entire face lit with an expression he had never once seen on her in her entire life. She reached him and threw her arms around his shoulders before pulling back, holding up her hand between them, breathless, unable to contain herself. "I said yes." Behind her, Carnell stood at the edge of the hallway, watching with quiet disbelief, as though he still couldn't fully process what had just happened only moments earlier at that table. Elena's father stared at his daughter's hand, then at her face, then past her toward Carnell, 100 conflicting emotions colliding behind his eyes all at once. Relief, fear, something almost like grief, arriving uninvited into a moment that should have belonged entirely to joy. He thought, absurdly, of the report cards locked away in his desk drawer, of every silent year he had spent trying to shield her from a world he himself had built, and he understood, standing frozen in that hallway, that none of it had ever been enough to protect her from the one thing he feared most, which was the past finally catching up to all of them at once. He forced himself to smile, to pull her into an embrace, to say the words a father is supposed to say in a moment like this. But some part of him remained fixed on the closed door behind him, on the muffled quiet coming from the other side of it, a silence that felt entirely too deliberate to be innocent. Carnell stepped forward and extended his hand, formally, respectfully, asking for the blessing a second time, though everyone standing in that hallway understood the question was now a formality rather than a genuine request. Elena's father took his hand, held it a beat longer than necessary, and studied the younger man's face for any trace of the father who had once destroyed everything he'd built. He found none. Whatever guilt lived in that family, it clearly hadn't been passed down. Behind him, the office door remained closed. Whatever was happening on the other side of it would have to wait. Because right now, standing in that hallway, caught between his daughter's happiness and a truth he had spent 22 years trying to bury, he had absolutely no idea which secret was about to destroy his family first. Cut to black. That's it for part 1. And yes, this story absolutely has a part 2. If you want it, drop part 2 in the comments right now. Hit subscribe if you're new here, and smash that like button so this reaches more people. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight.